Our next guest is well known to viewers. He's Dr. David Adler, the president of the Australian Jewish Association, and himself a very successful medical practitioner. Welcome, Dr. Adler.
Thank you so much, Professor David Flint, and always a privilege to join you.
Well, thank you, and a privilege to have you. I was writing something in Spectator this week, and I mentioned in the article, I suggested that Australians imagine if during the Second World War, as the Imperial Japanese were advancing through our territories in Papua New Guinea and bombing Darwin, if the foreign minister of a friendly country summons our ambassador to their foreign office and dressed down the ambassador and warned the Australian ambassador not to retaliate in any way to the Japanese invasion, the Japanese threats, the Japanese bombardment of Australia. I said, imagine what the outrage would be. And I suggested an analogy with what had happened with the Australian government when they summoned the Israeli ambassador to Foreign Affairs in Canberra and had him dressed down, not even by the foreign minister, but by an assistant minister, where he was told that notwithstanding the terrible bombings and bombardments and drone attacks and so on being waged by Hezbollah into the north of Israel, which had thrown 60 or 70,000 people out of their homes who had to be accommodated somewhere else in Israel, that Israel should not retaliate, if it so decided, against Hezbollah. Dr. Adler, what was your feeling when you read about this?
I think your analogy is very strong, David. Israel, at least until recently, had a very warm relationship with Australia, being an ally, being the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, the only place which is safe for people of all backgrounds. Obviously, it's the world's only Jewish state, but Christians, Muslims, anybody, the LGBTQ community, the only place in the Middle East that they're safe is in Israel. And this is a new low that Israel should be warned not to go after a proscribed terrorist organisation which has caused so much havoc in its north. Bombardments, it has killed some people in the north just in the last 48 hours. One of the Hezbollah missiles got through the Iron Dome and hit a couple driving in their car and killed them. And as you say, Israel has something in the order of 60 to 70,000 internal refugees. It's an outrageous situation, but it does something very bad domestically. As we all know and have seen on the streets of our capital cities, there has been a shocking rise of antisemitism. There have been attacks on Jewish people, on businesses. Our universities are in some cases unsafe for Jewish students and staff. And what this government has done is it has shifted our alignment away from Israel and towards Hezbollah. The domestic signal will embolden those whose views happen to align with proscribed terrorist organisations. This endangers not just the Jewish community, but the Australian community in general. We think it's a terrible, terrible development.
It suggests, doesn't it, that we are now aligned with the terrorist Hezbollah, and we are opposed to Israel defending itself against terrible attacks on Israel. This is a gross impertinence, is it not, on the part of the Albanese government?
you're right. And even though, for example, the Biden administration has had significant differences with the Israeli government, they have told Israel quite clearly that in the event that it needs to go after Hezbollah once it has properly disabled Hamas, the US will support Israel. They've moved one of the US carrier fleets again into the eastern Mediterranean to stand by in the event that Israel would need physical support as well as diplomatic support. So what Australia has done is not only distance itself from Israel, but has also distanced us from our most important defence ally, which is the United States. Very rare in history that that's happened, that Australia won't respect the defence alliance with the United States, and there is such polar opposite view, but that's happened in this case. I think it's against our national interest, frankly.
I trace this back to what happened when the Gillard government wanted to continue the bipartisan policy of not recognizing the non-state of Palestine in the United Nations, because it's not a state. It consists of basically two terrorist organizations plus the Palestinian Authority. And I think that there, when a senior minister in the Gillard government organized a caucus revolt there and is alleged to have justified the change in policy on the basis that how else could he defend, or how could he defend the government's policy on the steps of the Lakemba Mosque. Now that seems to be the litmus test for foreign policy for the ALP, which seems to me to be extraordinary, that you would judge your policy, determine your policy on how you think Muslim voters would vote in a number of electorates, and you're just making an assumption about the Muslim voters, and this seems to me to be not the way to run the foreign policy of this country.
Well, foreign policy used to be determined on what is Australia's national interest. And I think even since the Gillard era, that argument has progressed very substantially. And we'll recall that the Australian newspaper, I think it was in April this year, published an analysis of 29 federal electorates which had a significant Muslim vote, and 27 of the 29 are held by the Labor Party. So it may well be that a significant and perhaps dominant determining factor on Middle East policy in Australia now is grubby, local, domestic political considerations, with Labor seeing itself under threat in some of those seats by the Greens, and now we're learning that they may be under threat by an organised Muslim vote campaign, simply called the Muslim vote. And for people who haven't seen it, it's worth looking at the front page of today's Daily Telegraph in Sydney. And if you don't have a subscription, we've put an image of it on the AJA social media. That's the front page of the 11th of July, where they have traced and exposed an individual who is the corporate front for the company called the Muslim Vote. Now, he seems like a fairly low-key character, so we strongly suspect that behind him are more powerful, better resourced people. We've seen what's happened, and the Labor Party will have seen what's happened in the UK election, and are very worried about similar influences in Australia. So, David, I think the seed that you referred to in the Gillard government has now grown into something much more substantial, and it should be of concern to all Aussies.
Yes, there's no doubt that the Labour Party is in a panic. I call it the Payman panic over Senator Fatima Payman, who's left the Labour Party. She knew what the rules were of the Labour Party, including the caucus rule. She's decided that she will not accept that and she will continue in the Senate. And what I suggest in that Spectator article is that really we should have in Australia the right to recall elections. And I would think that the people of Western Australia would be very interested in a recall election concerning Senator Payman, because she is obviously not representing the people of Western Australia. She's decided to zero in on one particular piece of foreign policy. She's decided to zero in on the alleged difficulties of Muslims in a certain part of the world, ignoring completely, for example, the status of the Muslims in China, which has been going on for many years and which is appalling. But thank you very much, Dr. Adler. Is there anything you would like to finally add for the benefit of our viewers, the things that they should be looking for?
Well, I think that we really all have to step up and defend Australian democratic values. There are a number of threats. We've discussed one of them. We touched on the Greens, who are very much on this issue in the Senator Fatima Payman camp, and they present other threats as well. The outcome of the next federal election will be terribly important to determine the future of this country. So I hope people educate themselves and give a lot of thought as to what values they think are important in Australia going forward.
And I think finally it's worth noting, as often overlooked, that there are a large number of Arab citizens of Israel, Christians and Muslims, and that they are probably the only ones in the Middle East, perhaps in the world, certainly in the Arab world, where they have the human rights equivalent to those in other Western countries and democratic rights, and where there are members of parliament, members of the Knesset. There's a judge on the Supreme Court. It is very much a situation where there is no apartheid in Israel, and where full democratic and civil rights unknown in just about any other country in the Middle East exist. Israel is our ally and friend.
The interesting thing about the Israeli Arabs is that they've been fairly quiet. There are a few isolated examples, but the demonstrations and violence you see in Western capital cities is very dramatic. But the Arabs in Israel, they know the difference. If they didn't like the arrangement in Israel, they have many countries to choose from, and they choose to live in Israel. Some of them serve in the IDF and actively defend the land of Israel. And there have been no major Arab uprisings or even major demonstrations because they know what the alternative looks like, which is the loss of the sort of rights that you're talking about that they currently enjoy.
Dr. David Adler, you've put it very well. Thank you very much for the position you're taking and for the role you're playing in your organisation, and you're very welcome on this program. Thank you.
Thank you, David.